Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. Are you richer than your parents, or did they have it better off? Sometimes when we do this intergenerational wealth comparison, it can feel like the odds are stacked against us. But is that true? How do we measure who had it better or who has it better? I think there's a number of things you have to look at if you're going to try and answer this question. Things like investing habits, desired income, housing affordability, discretionary income, and the availability of financial knowledge. When it comes to investing, we probably all know by now that time is our best friend. And according to the Charles Schwab annual Modern Wealth Survey, it seems like each generation is getting better and better at taking advantage of time and making it their greatest ally. Consider this: the average age the typical baby boomer started investing was 35. By the time millennials entered the workspace, on average, they were investing by the age of 25, a full decade sooner. And the youngest generation, Gen Z, currently has an average starting investing age of just 19. By starting earlier and earlier, each generation is making their journey to wealth creation easier and easier. Let's consider the impact of starting at such a young age. Let's compare how each generation started, their typical average age, and say you had invested $250 a month, doing that until the age of 65, assuming an 8% rate of annual return. In this case, with a starting investing age of 35, 30 years of investing would allow our investor to accumulate about $375,000. Notably, starting just 3 years earlier actually makes a fairly significant difference, helping our investor get close to $500,000. With a starting age of 25, that portfolio can grow to nearly $875,000. But starting right out of the gate at age 19 has a huge impact, growing that portfolio to over $1.4 million. So simply by starting earlier and earlier, each generation should theoretically have an easier path to wealth creation, assuming they stick with it and continue for the long term. I think a lot of the feeling of wealth comes down to two main points: net worth and income. And I think both of these matter. When we talk about measuring wealth, a lot of times we talk about that in terms of net worth, and I think that's a great measure. But a lot of times, especially during the working years, I feel like that feeling of wealth can really better be tied to income. If you have an income that allows you to cover all of your expenses and still set aside something towards investments and still gives you some breathing room in your budget, that can go a long way to helping you feel wealthy. Compare that to someone who is literally counting down the days until their next paycheck hits their bank. This is a very different situation. So if we look at it like this, that feeling of wealth can really come at practically any income. It just depends on the lifestyle you're trying to fund. When we look at each generation and the income they say they need in order to feel wealthy, we see that most generations agree that an income needed to feel wealthy is roughly $120,000 to $130,000 per year. Well, all generations except for millennials. Millennials say they would need an income of almost $525,000 a year in order to feel wealthy. Now that's a huge jump from the other generations, but part of this might be bias. Millennials are in that so-called messy middle of life, or the most expensive years of life. Many are first-time home buyers in a very expensive housing market. Perhaps they're even starting a family, and young kids can come with heavy daycare costs. They may still be carrying student loan debt, and trying to juggle all of this while feeling the pressure to save for tomorrow can leave you feeling like there's just no room left in your budget. And that can leave you with the feeling of, maybe I don't know what the exact income is to feel wealthy, but I know it's got to be a heck of a lot more than what I'm making right now. If we were to compare those numbers to the median income that each generation is making, we can see that there is quite a gap. And the further you feel you are from where you mentally think you should be, the further you're going to feel behind, or that you're just treading water to keep up. The biggest expense most of us will ever face is housing, and having access to affordable housing is seemingly more of a challenge today than it was for previous generations. It's basically every day that we see a new headline about how unaffordable housing is these days. So let's look at how the overall cost of a home has changed over the years. If we compare the median household income to the median cost of a home sold in America since 1970 through 2020, it's easy to see that housing costs relative to incomes have not increased at the same rate. Back in 1970, if you earned the median household income and bought the median priced home, you would be looking at a ratio of about 2.6 of housing cost to income, meaning that it would take 2.6 years worth of income to afford the typical home. Fast forward to 2020, and that ratio is nearly 4.9, meaning that if you were earning the typical income and bought the typical home, you would need nearly 5 years' worth of income in order to afford that home. This ratio speaks to the disparity between incomes and housing. It shows that the price of housing has increased at a rate that has far outpaced the increase in incomes over the years. And this is a huge crux as to why when people go to buy homes these days, they feel their budgets are so stretched. And it's really been in the past 20 years or so that we've seen housing prices surge. And the generations that have benefited most in this surge in home prices, it's the previous owners. It's the earlier generations, think baby boomers, and the more mature Gen X members. So while other generations have seen a boost to their bottom line, millennials are having the opposite problem. High housing costs are forcing their budgets to run leaner as housing costs are eating a greater percentage of their income. I think another key talking point is disposable and discretionary income, and more importantly, discretionary income. Your disposable income is the income that's left over after you've paid taxes. On the other hand, your discretionary income is what remains after you've not only paid taxes, but also paid for your necessities. Think housing, transportation, food, things like that. And this is really the income you get to work with, to have fun with, to enjoy life with. And yes, while we've seen a fairly steady increase in disposable income through the years, discretionary income hasn't kept the same exact trajectory. Yes, disposable income has steadily increased over the years, but so too have everyday costs. Housing costs have increased, inflationary pressures have increased the price of food and shelter and things like that. And that means that discretionary income in recent years has actually taken a hit. This is forcing budgets to run tighter, and it's meaning that maybe there isn't as much money to enjoy life beyond the essentials. And having your discretionary income get squeezed can make it feel like life is really expensive, like you aren't as wealthy as you should be, or maybe you don't feel as wealthy as previous generations did. I think when we look at access to financial products and information about finance, the landscape today is so wildly different than it was 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. What things looked like a generation or two ago are almost unrecognizable compared to today. I might think of it like this. I drive a 2008 Jeep, and I actually test drove a Tesla. When I got in the Tesla, it was like getting in a spaceship. It was almost unrecognizable compared to my car. These two were so wildly different. When I started investing, there was no easy way to buy stocks. You first had to get the paper, look up the ticker symbol for the stock you wanted, then you would walk over to your phone, which hung on the wall in the kitchen with about 10 feet of cord, and you would call a broker who would have to execute this trade. And oh yeah, you couldn't just buy $20 worth of a stock. Generally, you had to buy stocks in round lots or increments of 100 shares at a time, and that made it incredibly expensive. Also, at the time, index funds weren't nearly as popular. Rather, it was mutual funds that dominated the scene, and they had hefty expense ratios. These days, we have all these different platforms that allow you to buy stocks and make trades with the simple click of a button. You also have fractional trading, which allow you to buy partial shares. Investing today is wildly different than it was before. The investing landscape has been forever changed. It's made investing available to the masses. Also, never before has financial information been so widely available, and we have a culture that is getting more and more comfortable discussing money matters. Financial matters are the subject of mainstream media. This was not the case even a decade ago. And there's a lot to be said for access to education that enables you to build wealth. If you're willing to gain the knowledge and apply the knowledge, it's actually fairly easy to build wealth. So in terms of access to knowledge and ease of investing, younger generations actually have it much easier than their parents did. I think it's also worth mentioning that only about a third of Americans have a written out financial plan. But importantly, of those who have a written financial plan, 96% feel they are more in control of their finances and confident they will reach their financial goals. To me, that says if you want to feel like you're in control of your financial life, you need a written financial plan, no matter what your income is, no matter what your age is. And I think really there are two pieces to this puzzle. You have to establish a goal, and then you have to establish a plan to reach this goal. And these two things work in tandem. If there's a disconnect, you have to address one or the other. You either have to change your plan or you have to change your goal. But I think there's a huge benefit to writing it down, because writing it down makes it real. I think answering the question of, are you richer than your parents, or are you wealthier than the generations that came before you, is fairly complex. Point blank, I feel like if you ask millennials or those older Gen Z members, they might be inclined to immediately say no. And that might have to do more with the fact that they're in a more expensive time of life, that housing costs have outpaced incomes, that we've seen a reduction in discretionary income. We tend to answer questions based on how we feel in the immediate moment, whereas older generations might be more established in their careers. Maybe they have more equity in their home. Maybe they're just further along in life. But I also think these younger generations have a greater capacity to build wealth than the previous generations did. Simply having so much access to investing education by the simple fact that they've started investing at a younger age. It's very realistic to assume that these younger generations might end up in a far better position than their parents ever could have simply by how they got started. This does assume that they continue investing throughout the course of their entire working career. So when it comes to the question of, are you richer than your parents? Are the younger generations wealthier than the generations that came before them? In some respects, I would say yes. But in other respects, I would say no. I don't really think there's a black and white answer to this one. I feel like there's lots of shades of gray. What are your thoughts? Leave them in a comment down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. Okay. But is that true? How do you measure?